Assalamu alaikum. There was once a nun. Her name was Roswitha, and she lived in Germany in the 10th century. When asked about Andalusia, and specifically the city of Cordoba, she described it as the ornament of the world. Had she ever been to Cordoba? No, and yet she'd heard stories about it and used to talk about it with other nuns that live in her convent. They had heard about the libraries, and they'd heard about the exchange of ideas that happened in the magnificent city. A French scholar named Gilbert of Aurillac is someone else that we should mention. He lived in the 10th century as well, a little bit later on, and he had access to the best libraries in Europe. And yet, something about Cordoba captured his imagination. He decided to actually journey over to the city of Cordoba to see it for himself. He gathered as many books as he could in Cordoba as he could carry and brought them all the way back to France with him. There he read each one, tirelessly taking notes. And when he was done, he used these ideas to write his own books. But Gerbert was not just a teacher or a scholar. In April of the year 999, he became Pope Sylvester II. When we talk about Andalusia or al-Andalus or Muslim Spain with its capital in the city of Cordoba, we are talking about a Muslim kingdom that existed in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, from the early 8th century all the way to the early 11th century. The name al-Andalus itself comes from a name that the Muslims themselves used to describe the Iberian Peninsula, and it probably comes from something that is along the lines of the land of the Vandals. And the Vandals, they were a Germanic people that lived in that peninsula in the 5th century. So that name eventually kind of morphed or developed into the name al-Andalus or Andalusia as we come to know it. The story of Muslim Spain is born out of a war, out of a conflict between two Muslim dynasties, the Abbasids and the Umayyads. At the time our story begins, the Abbasids were trying to take power away from a much weaker Umayyad dynasty and trying to position themselves as the new leaders of the Muslims. At this time, several Umayyad leaders and rulers had been either forced out of power or killed. But one of them, his name was Abdurrahman I. He managed to escape. He managed to get away. And he made it all the way to North Africa. And there, he started to plan. He had a dream, so to speak. He wanted to try to position himself as the new leader of the Muslims. And he knew that in order to do this, he would have to find a place to call his capital. He started to gather forces, started to create a mercenary army. And he knew that this was going to be a challenge because the Umayyad governor and general who was in power in Cordoba, in Andalusia, his name was Yusuf al-Fihri. And he was a serious leader, right? He was a serious ruler. So here we have Abdurrahman. He's putting together an army. What does he have to work with? An army of mercenaries. And this is tough, right? Because, mercenaries, they fight for money. So if somebody else comes along and gives them a better deal, they're going to take that deal. So here we have Abdurrahman trying to win over these fighters so that he can go and take over Andalusia. Now, this is going to be a challenge, as we said, but he is able to do this, and he defeats Yusuf al-Fihri's forces outside of the city of Cordoba. Now, there's no accident then that right after he does this, he decides to call Cordoba his capital. It's supposed to be symbolic in that his victory happened there, so this is going to be the place where he makes his capital. And he does this, and he doesn't want it just to be any capital, because like many leaders we've seen in our past, whenever we have these moments in history when something amazing happens, it is because that leader has a dream. He's motivated, right, by a dream. So he wants it to be not just a capital, but the capital. What a capital it was. He sets up a new administration. He brings in Syrian culture. He sets up schools. He sets up a standing army. He also decides to embark on reforms and features in his government and in the society that many people had never seen. Like, for example, establishing a new system, a new legal system, right? So a system of judges that are overseen by a senior qadi. All of this is happening, and it attracts the attention of the Abbasids, which, remember, we said they're watching the Umayyads very closely. And they look at this and they say, this can't happen, right? Abdurrahman and what he's doing, right, in Cordoba, it can't happen. So they send an army. And he's ready because remember, he expected this challenge. And he goes out and he annihilates really, okay, the Abbasid forces because remember, he's motivated by a dream, something very big. And to send a message to the Abbasids, he actually takes all of their generals out, the leaders of their army, and he executes them all. And he cuts off their heads and he sends the heads back to the Abbasids to send a message, okay, that this is never going to happen again. And it doesn't happen again, right? No surprise. Now, the Abbasids are, let's say, scared of approaching the matter of Andalusia again, and they don't. Abdurrahman continues with establishing this magnificent city that he had dreamt of. He built magnificent masajid. He built schools and hospitals, right, as we mentioned. He introduced reforms as well. And he was also a planner, a strategist, in that he decided that he was going to divide Andalusia into 6 military provinces, so it would be easier for him to administer it. He treated the Christian civilian population with fairness. This was the reputation that he gained. Now, infighting over the succession is going to plague Abdurrahman's family after his death. So we're going to have a period of turmoil, right, after his death. However, later in the 10th century, the Muslims in Cordoba gain a new leader, and his name was Abdurrahman III. And it's Abdurrahman III, of course, that has the reputation of being the leader that oversaw the Muslim, so to speak, golden age, right? This is the golden age of Andalusia. Abdurrahman III ruled for nearly 50 years. And he was the one who guided the Muslims through turbulent relations with Christian neighbors, other kingdoms around the Muslim kingdom of Andalusia. He always regrouped whenever those Christian kingdoms were fighting among themselves, right? So they would sometimes attack the Muslims, and during the time when they were fighting with each other, he would regroup and he would establish peace and security once again. Under his reign, Cordoba became the seat of Europe's first Academy of Medicine. It became a center for scholars, for architects, for geographers, for scientists of every kind. And eventually, we see that this attracts the attention of intellectuals, similar to the stories I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion. So Europeans began to travel to see Cordoba for themselves, and many of their accounts survive, right? We can actually read how amazed they were about what was happening in Cordoba. Eventually, the Umayyad kingdom in al-Andalus collapsed after a disastrous civil war. All of this happening in the early 11th century. What are the causes of this? Most of it stemmed from fighting between Muslim factions, and they allowed themselves to be lured by so-called help from neighboring Christian kingdoms. So these Christian kingdoms were only too delighted to see the Muslims fighting among themselves. So they would go in and say, we'll assist you in your claim, right, to be the leader. And another group would come and say, we'll assist you in your claim. And all of a sudden you have a civil war. The Reconquista, which is the military takeover of Muslim lands by Christian princes, accelerated because of this civil war, right? It was faster and it was very, very traumatic for the Muslims. What are the lessons that we can derive from this? We talked about Abdurrahman I. We talked about Abdurrahman III. These were leaders who had dreams. They wanted to establish societies based on a vision of something amazing. But all of this, how easy can it be torn down by the attractions of the dunya, by the desire for power, by greed, all of the things that we're warned against by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So for us, let us take these as lessons. Let us be inspired and motivated by the greatness of al-Andalus, but let us also be cautious based on the reasons for its ultimate decline and demise. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.